Now, we have spoken at length about the ways in which American society and culture have changed since we started this class. We have looked at the ways in which technology has changed our world. We have looked at the differences in our home life as a result of these things. We have talked somewhat about the demographic changes in the American population due to things like birth rates and immigration and stuff like that. But one thing that needs to be spoken about is the fact that whenever you've had changes come to a society, and that doesn't just mean ours, but pretty much throughout all of history, there usually comes a point in time of reflection. There comes a moment when we've had a number of changes occur, and a society stops to take a look at what those changes are and try to figure out, has everything worked out for the best? Are there improvements that could be made? Things like that. So we're going to talk about something called progressivism. Now, progressivism is a kind of theory, political philosophy, however you want to phrase it, in the late 1800s and going into the early 1900s. The progressives would eventually have their very own political party. They would have their own presidential candidates. And progressivism and progressives would have a major impact on American society, culture, politics, all of the above from this time frame all the way forward. It was an attempt to try and improve life in general. It was the idea of trying to improve the workplace, trying to make sure that conditions were better, that people weren't, being exploited, kind of thing. You also had an attempt to change the politics of the time, trying to make government at all levels more responsive to the desires and wants of the people. So you're going to see a lot of these changes trying to be implemented at the time. Okay, a lot of this is going to be in the style of a reform, and it's going to be something, like I said, that is going to have long-term impacts on American society and culture from the turn of the 20th century all the way to the present day. And when all is said and done, it will be up to you to decide whether or not everything worked out fantastically well, exactly like planned. Was it somewhere on a starting point, or did they fail miserably? And again, it will also be up to you to decide whether or not their success or failure was a good or a bad thing. Now, there were four main goals of progressivism. There were a number of different areas in which the progressives wanted to have some kind of influence, that they wanted to make some kind of change and whatnot. But in all honesty, we can kind of, narrow these down to four general topics in which the progressives were trying to make a difference in American society and culture. Okay, the first one is going to be protecting social welfare. Now, social welfare is really talking about quality of life. They're trying to make people's lives better, in particular those living in the cities. The idea is to be able to go through and to help improve the lot of life for the greatest number of people. Now, reformers wanted to promote this social welfare by easing the various problems of city life. Now, remember, we have talked at length about some of the different issues of city life. You're talking about crowding, you're talking about sanitation, you're talking about, sometimes limits on education and things along these lines. So the various issues that have come up at different points in regards to urbanization, those are still existing at this point. Now, you could also make the argument that these are sort of like an eternal problem that will continue to exist because we have yet to solve all the issues of mankind. But, at this point, we're just kind of trying to narrow our focus a little bit. So, social reformers at this point in time, for the most part, we're going to be talking about middle class individuals. They wanted to go through and help figure out ways to ease the problems of city life. Now, in some respects, you could go through and try and do this via political means. You could go through and try and change the government, that kind of way. But sometimes it's going to have a better effect if you're just doing things on what could be termed a person-to-person basis. That you're going to go through and you're trying to do things through private industry. For example, you had an organization, the YMCA, which stood for the Young Men's Christian Association. They're going to be found in cities throughout the nation. They're going to build libraries. They're going to build exercise rooms. They're going to provide people with a place to stay. It's going to essentially kind of tie back to that settlement house kind of theory. But in this case, it's for guys that are in a town that haven't, they may have just moved there and whatnot. They haven't set up any kind of residence yet. Or it could be, the libraries and whatnot. That could be for people to expand their minds, to, get some more education that would help them further on down the road. The exercise rooms, they had a tendency to build things like swimming pools, handball or racquetball courts, things along those lines. In Modesto, for example, the YMCA used to have was a really good spot to go play racquetball. I don't know if it still exists or not. But they went through and they did all of these things to try and make improvements in the city. They were trying to help people have a better life by providing access to these things. There was also, around this time, shortly thereafter, you would have what was called the YWCA, same kind of concept, except that was for women. So you would have, essentially, you can look at this as part of that settlement house idea in that you're going to have education and health aspects trying to be promoted, plus at the same time, inexpensive temporary living quarters. So the YMCA is going to sprout up in a number of different cities all across the nation. Another organization at this time was the Salvation Army. Salvation Army went through, and one of the big things that they were responsible for were helping people who were hungry. So the Salvation Army is going to start trying to provide food for poor people. Now, in some cases, that could be the concept of the soup kitchen, where they actually prepare food, and give it out. In other cases, it can be that the Salvation Army is going through and collecting groceries or whatnot, or things along those lines to give to families and whatnot to use to prepare their own foods. But essentially we're looking at the Salvation Army saw a particular need in the cities. They saw that there were people who were hungry, and instead of trying to go through the government or trying to set something up like that, they simply went through, they saw the problem, and they went to work on it. Salvation Army still exists throughout the nation today. Most of the time, people only think about the Salvation Army when they see the bell ringers at Christmas time taking donations. But they went through, they helped feed poor people. They also provided child care for people, people who had to work. They would provide nurseries where children could stay. So again, you're looking at a private organization seeing the various problems that are rampant in the cities, especially at this point in time, and trying to come up with a way to help people by providing for whatever that issue or whatever that problem is. Now, we mentioned how these were kind of tied in with the old settlement house aspect. Now, we talked about that previously. Settlement houses were still around at this time. They were still helping various families. They were helping immigrants. They were there again to act as sort of a community center. They were there to try and provide education and health care and things along those lines to help people, again, improve their lot in life. All of this was being done to try and help people improve their lives. Now, there's no guarantee that just because all this was available, that all sorts of lives would be improved dramatically, but sometimes you have to measure success, one person at a time. So the settlement houses were there as well. You've got things like the YMCA, Salvation Army, settlement houses. All of these are there trying to help individuals and families within the cities with a variety of issues that they see coming up. Now, one of the people at this point in time is a woman by the name of Florence Kelley. Okay, now Florence Kelley was a very committed social activist. She was very concerned with the plight of people who were seen as really helpless. In particular, at this point in time, she was trying to work very hard to help both women and children. There was a lot of child labor going on at this particular time, and as such, Florence Kelley would essentially question people about why there were so many rules protecting different animals and things like that in the national parks, but nothing to protect children. So she's going to go through and she's going to help pass a piece of legislation called the Illinois Factory Act of 1893. Generally speaking, we don't get a lot of cool names for this kind of stuff. Now, the Illinois Factory Act, this is going to have a major impact on the working world. Okay, now we talked about social welfare, that this was just trying to improve people's lot in life, and you're going to see how this is trying to help some of those who are working, but not necessarily because they want to be out there with a job of some kind, but more like circumstances force them to do such things. Okay. Now, the Illinois Factory Act went through and it prohibited child labor and limited women's working hours. Up to this point in time, you could quite literally have, for example, little kids, 5-year-olds. Their job would be at, say, a bowling alley to go through and reset the pins after they'd been knocked down. Now, today we have machines that do that automatically, but once upon a time that had to be done by hand. And so you would have these little kids down there working on things along those lines. Plus, hiring kids was beneficial because one, you didn't have to pay them nearly as much. Two, they were small enough to kind of climb in and around the machinery and get to different areas that a full grown adult would not be able to get to. The drawback is it was just as dangerous for kids as it was for an adult, and you could very easily end up maimed or dead. And it was just, the cost of doing business at that point in time. There was no social safety net. So if you ended up, with some kind of disability, that was just your own problem. They hired somebody new to replace you, and that was it. The other thing it did, in addition to prohibiting child labor, is it limited women's working hours. This is a time frame long before we had any kind of concept of the 40-hour work week. Today, we think of the fact that if you work 8 hours a day at a job, anything over that is considered overtime. But this is a point in time well before that had ever come into existence or thinking or anything like that. And so the limitations were placed on how many hours a woman could be required to work, partially in the concept that it would benefit her and her family if she was able to be at home, with the kids or anything along those lines. Not necessarily not to work, but not to be forced to be there from dawn till dusk kind of thing. So you did go through and you did start to see some changes, not just with the kids, but with women. And the idea is Florence Kelly, like I said, wanted to really help those in society who seemed to have the least amount of protections. And at this point in time, that would have been women and children. Now, the Illinois Factory Act really became a model for all the other states. Other states all around the nation started to follow suit. And this wasn't something that overnight, all of a sudden, there were no problems whatsoever with the working world. Everybody was in a good mood. Everybody had a safe job with good pay or anything like that. But it did become the model that other states wanted to emulate. It was what other states wanted to do. They wanted to try and get something similar to this particular law. Now, granted, we live in the United States with something called federalism. So we have essentially 50 laboratories of democracy today. Each state can pretty much do for itself the way it wants to. Now, in this case, no two states are going to be exactly alike, but the various states are going to go through and they are going to try very hard to, as I said, to emulate, to try and copy at least somewhat this Illinois Factory Act. So the first real goal of progressivism was going through and trying to protect social welfare. Second goal we're going to look at is promoting moral improvement. Now, there are those who will argue that essentially if this is the government trying to, order what is and is not morality, you can definitely make that argument. But this is, again, not so much a government program trying to change anything, as opposed to individuals, private organizations, trying to convince people that the way they want to do A, B, C, or D, whatever it is, that is the better choice. And so they're trying to do this. Now, the biggest thing that the progressives were working toward in regards to moral improvement was that of prohibition. Okay, they wanted to completely ban alcohol throughout the entire United States. They wanted to try and make sure that there was no manufacture, sale, transportation, consumption, anything. They wanted to make sure that alcohol was completely banned in America. Now, the argument behind this was that it led to obviously drunkenness, but it also led to difficulties for the families. It led to people being really destitute because they were losing money in that the main breadwinner of the home was not actually going to work, but instead was just getting drunk and things like that. So they wanted to go through and really change America's attitude toward drinking in general. Now, a number of the progressives at this point in time were members of an organization called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. Now, temperance unions had been around for a long time. You can go back into the early 1800s, and there were those individuals pushing to have alcohol either made illegal or limited or something along those lines. And you will see that eventually we get to a point where they do get a constitutional amendment, the 18th Amendment, which bans all alcohol in the United States. And when we get to that point, we'll talk about that later. But the Women's Christian Temperance Union was the largest women's organization that the nation had ever seen. And there were a lot of people who were a part of this because they did have family members who were, basically at the mercy of what was referred to oftentimes as the demon rum. That there were a lot of people whose families had been very much torn apart by the issues of alcoholism. And you could make the argument that banning it completely may be the greatest idea, or you can make the argument that it didn't work under prohibition. And, we still have these arguments today in regards to issues like this. The fact is that, you still have the issue of alcoholism is prevalent within American society. So you can see that while progressives were trying very hard to make a change, they weren't always going to be successful. Now, they were pushing at this point in time more of a theory that just we're trying to convince everyone. We're trying to convince the vast majority of the nation that our goal is right, that the way we're looking at how to live life is the right thing. At this point, it isn't some kind of government edict. It's not some kind of requirement by the government saying this is how you shall live your life or anything like that. You can think back to when we talked about Pullman, Illinois, how well that worked when you were told what you could and couldn't do. In this case, again, it is the aspect of trying to convince people, trying to show them that my way is better, trying to live through means of example. And you are going to see that they did win a number of converts. As you can see on this, since it was the largest women's organization ever, they did have a lot of success in getting people to come over. And the fact that eventually we did have a constitutional amendment does prove that they were able to succeed at a big chunk of this. However, convincing people of one thing and ordering them are two totally different things. But it was an attempt to try and improve the nation by at least removing, at least one aspect of life that was really causing a great deal of grief for a large number of people. This was a point in time when alcohol consumption was much more prominent than it is now. And so you could make the argument that since it is less prominent today than it was way back when, that perhaps they did have long-term effects that they had not thought about, but they didn't succeed at what their ultimate goal was, the complete removal of all alcohol from all American society for all time. They did for a brief while, and then they changed the Constitution again. The third goal of progressivism dealt with economics. They were looking at how to go about reforming basically the entire economy of the United States, and if they really had their way, the whole world, trying to change globally people's outlook and thoughts as to how work should be done, the way in which people should be paid, treated, etc., etc., etc. Now, we already kind of talked a little bit about the fact that there were some changes coming in regards to children working and women in the labor force. But at this point, now we're going to look a little bit more at the overall picture of economics in general in regards to progressives. Okay? Now, reformers wanted to make changes. Okay? They wanted to go through and they wanted to make these changes, especially in regards to the inequality between rich and poor. Now, there has always been what oftentimes people refer to as a wealth gap, that there is a real disparity, there is a difference between those with a great deal of money and those with very little money. Now, traditionally, the biggest portion of the American economy has been what's referred to as the middle class. These are the people who aren't the super rich and they're not, poor off. They're just, essentially in the middle. But reformers wanted to make these changes because they wanted to try and decrease the gap between rich and poor. Now, you can go through and you can make the argument against progressive, saying that they basically wanted to make those who had money make those poorer. You could use the progressive argument that they were trying to make those who had little get them more stuff and get them more money and things along those lines. But again, this is one of those areas of political debate and discourse that really is going to be up to you to decide if their goals, if their intentions, if their means and whatnot were those the right things to do, the wrong things to do. Again, I leave that up to you. You can go through and do some research as to what was going on at that point in time. Now, in addition to trying to decrease the wealth gap, as we called it, they also pushed for a better treatment of workers. Now, you've got to keep in mind, this was a point in time when there were no, what we call OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. There were no OSHA laws. There was nothing to protect you if you were at work. There was really no safety equipment or anything like that. If you were working somewhere and you got an arm ripped off, or you lost a finger, or you got killed, or you were disabled in some way, that was pretty much your problem. They would hire somebody to replace you, and you were just out on your own. So the progressives were pushing for better working conditions. They wanted to make sure that people who were working in at least a relatively safe environment. There will always be jobs that are more dangerous than others, but they wanted to try and put at least some minimal requirements for the protection of the people working there. We've been talking about things like working hours and who can and can't work. Children, for example. But this is sort of just the overall better treatment. They wanted the workers to actually be treated with more respect than they felt they were getting at that point in time, and to also know that you were working somewhere at least relatively safe. Now, at this point in time, you had a number of journalists who are referred to as muckrakers. Okay, they wrote stories about corruption and unfair practices in business. They went through and they wrote very sensational stories. They were really talking about some of the worst examples of, fill in the blank that could possibly happen in regards to, anything within the working environment. You had one guy named Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle, and the whole purpose of that was to really show how bad off the immigrant workers in the meatpacking industry at that point in time had it, how bad their working conditions were. Well, what really was taken away from that by the people who read the book was the unclean conditions in which the meat was being packed. That you could have rats or different things accidentally ground up into the meat, and there are even rumored stories that every once in a while somebody would fall in and get ground up into the meat. So you did have people writing in newspapers and writing books and things like that, trying to get the word out to as many people as possible about the negative conditions that people were suffering through just to try and earn enough money to keep a roof over their head or to keep food on the table. So the muckrakers, they weren't very popular with the business leaders and the business owners, but they were much more popular with the workers themselves. Another thing that the progressives were looking at, the fourth thing, efficiency. Okay, they were going to go through and they wanted to look at every aspect of life, work, etc. They wanted to try and make sure that things were being done as efficiently as possible, that there wasn't a great deal of wasted time and resources and things along those lines. So some of the reformers promoted the idea of what's referred to as scientific management. Okay, the idea behind scientific management was that you were going to go through and you were going to look at the way science looked at things. And they were going to use this to basically apply it to every task that existed. The idea was to make each task simpler. You would go through and you would try to simplify whatever the operation was to make things go much more quickly, much more smoothly, without a lot of issues, problems, or anything along those lines. It was the idea that you could take anything apply science to it, and figure out ways to make it go more smoothly. The practical upshot of all this here with the concept of efficiency was the assembly line. And you have Henry Ford as probably the most famous individual using an assembly line. It was essentially unskilled labor. You didn't have to be trained a great deal. The assembly line essentially is you do one task repeatedly over and over again for X number of hours per day. Yes, it was much simpler. Yes, it was much more was much quicker to get things done that way. But at the same time, it did lead to certain issues as well. The concept I've heard it referred to as like line hypnosis, where you're seeing the same thing going by over and over again, and you just sort of zone out. So you were going through, and the progressives were using science and experts to try and make the system work a little bit better. They didn't want it to have a great deal of waste and inefficiency. And while there were great examples of things becoming more efficient, it wasn't always going to have the desired effects. It was more efficient, but it might not necessarily make things better for the people who were involved.